The late Harappan cultures are primarily chalcolithic, in which tools of stone and copper are used. The chalcolithic people in the later Harappan phase lived in villages subsisting on agriculture, stock raising, hunting, and fishing. Some places such as Prabhaspatan, Somnath, and Rangpur, both in Gujarat, are the direct descendants of the Harappan culture. Some exotic tools and pottery indicate the slow percolation of new peoples in the Indus Valley during the later phases of the Harappan culture. A few signs of insecurity and violence appear in the last phase of Mohenjo-daro. Hoards of jewelry were buried at places and skulls huddled together at one place. New types of axes, daggers, knives, and midribs and flat tangs appear in the upper levels of Mohenjo-daro. They seem to betray some foreign intrusion. At several sites in Punjab and Haryana, painted grey ware, generally associated with the Vedic people, have been found in conjunction with some late Harappan pottery dated around 1200 BC. But we have no archaeological evidence of any mass-scale confrontation between the mature Harappans and the Aryans. Probably the Aryans encountered the people of the late Harappan phase, 1800 BC to 1200 BC. There is not enough evidence to say with certainty that the destroyers of the Indus cities were members of the group of related tribes whose priests composed the Rig Veda. But probably the fall of this great civilization was partly due to the widespread migratory movement of charioteering people which altered the face of the whole civilized world in the second millennium BC. Scholars have assigned several possible reasons for the decline of the civilization. The floods in the Indus rivers might have caused its destruction. It is also supposed that the Indus might have changed its course, thus rendering the valley infertile. The river valley might have lost its charm and the inhabitants might have left it for good. Or perhaps, due to the deficient rainfall and deforestation, there might have appeared desert conditions in the valley. It is even suggested that an earthquake might have caused its destruction, as in Quetta. The Vedic Age. Who were the Aryans? There is good archaeological evidence to show that in the centuries following 2000 BC, northwest India was invaded by some tribes from the west. They were called Aryans, who ultimately occupied the greater part of northern India. It is believed that initially the Aryans lived together in a common place. Subsequently, because of several reasons, the Aryans in groups moved in different directions. A sizable number migrated to India. This branch of Aryans who migrated and settled in India are called Indo-Aryans. Original home of the Aryans. Of the many theories that have been put forward by scholars and historians regarding the original home of the Aryans, the Central Asian theory of Max Müller is accepted most widely. Max Müller has identified Central Asia as the original home of the Aryans. He has based his view on the study of the world's languages. The significant evidence is that there are fundamental similarities among some ancient languages such as Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit, and the resemblances continue in the languages derived from them. For instance, Pitri, Sanskrit for father, and Pater, Latin for father, sound similar, and so does Matri and Mater for mother. Max Müller therefore concluded that the ancestors of the Indians, the Greeks, the Romans, the English, and some other peoples must have originally resided at a common place. The Austro-Hungarian theory, propounded by Dr. Giles and Professor MacDonald, consider the banks of the Danube River, southeast Europe, to have been the original home of the Aryans. Putting forward the Sapta-Sindhu theory, many Indian historians, including Dr. Sampurnanand and Avinash Chandra Das, point out that modern Punjab and Sindh region, or Sapta Sindhu, was where the Aryans originated. The view is based on study of geographical features mentioned in the hymns of the Rig Veda. From the description of certain natural phenomena, such as long evenings, days, and nights of 6 months' duration, etc., in the Rig Veda, Lokmanya Tilak came to the conclusion that the original home of the Aryans was in the regions near the North Pole. He reached this view after the close study of several ancient books, such as the Rig Veda and the Zend-Avesta. Swami Dayanand wrote in the Satyarth Prakash that the original home of the Aryans was Tibet. As their population grew, they could not continue to stay in Tibet and thus migrated towards India. His view is supported by F.E. Pargita. Advent of the Aryans. According to generally accepted views, about 2000 BC, the great steppe land from Poland to Central Asia was inhabited by semi-nomadic barbarians who were tall, comparatively fair, and mostly long-headed. They had tamed the horse to pull light chariots with spoked wheels. They were mainly pastoral, but practiced a little agriculture. They had adopted some Mesopotamian innovations, notably the shaft-hole axe. In the early part of the second millennium, whether from pressure of population, desiccation of pasture lands, or from both causes, these people were on the move. They migrated in bands westwards, southwards, and eastwards, conquering local populations. They brought with them their patrilineal family system, their worship of sky gods, and their horses and chariots. Their original language gradually adapted itself to the tongues of the conquered peoples. Some invaded Europe to become the ancestors of the Greeks, Latins, Celts, and Teutons. Others moved southwards to the Caucasus and the Iranian tableland. The marauding tribesmen also gradually came to India. These invaders of India called themselves Aryas, a word generally anglicized into Aryans. The name was also used by the ancient Persians and survives in the word Iran. The Aryans spoke the Indo-European languages, which are current in changed forms all over Europe, Iran, and the greater part of the Indian subcontinent. Certain names of animals, such as goats, dogs, horses, etc., and names of certain plants, such as pine, maple, etc., are similar to one another in all the Indo-European languages. The Aryans did not lead a settled life, so they could not leave behind any solid material remains. Making their way to India, the Aryans first appeared in Iran, where the Indo-Iranians lived for a long time. We learn about the Aryans in India from the Rig Veda, which is the earliest specimen of the Indo-European languages and has much in common with the Avesta, the oldest text in the Iranian language. Date of immigration. In order to determine the date of the arrival of the Aryans in India, we must first look for the age of the Rig Veda. There is much difference of opinion in this regard. Some lay down the year 1000 BC as the earliest limit for the Rig Vedic hymns, while others consider them to have originated between 3000 and 2500 BC. The most decisive evidence in calculating the age of Rig Veda is the fact that Jainism and Buddhism presuppose its existence. Keeping this in mind, we may conclude that the Aryans appeared in northwestern India not later than 1500 BC. The early Vedic period is roughly dated from 1500 to 1000 BC. The later Vedic period extends from 1000 to 600 BC. The Rig Vedic Settlements. Most of the hymns of the Rig Veda were probably composed in the country around the river Saraswati, now lost in the sands of Rajasthan. The Aryan occupation of Afghanistan and the Punjab is proved by the mention in the Rig Veda of the rivers Jagsartas, Kabul, Swat, Kurram, Gumal, Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Beas, and Satluj. The Himalayas were well known, but the Vindhyas were unknown. Thus we can safely conclude that the Aryan settlements were confined to eastern Afghanistan, modern Pakistan, Punjab, and parts of modern Uttar Pradesh. The major part of this area was known as the land of Sapta Sindhu, the Indus and its 5 tributaries, and the Saraswati. When the hymns were written, the focus of Aryan culture was the region between the Yamuna and the Satluj. The region was referred to as Brahmavarta and along the upper course of the river Saraswati. To the east, the Aryans had not expanded far beyond the Yamuna, and the Ganga is mentioned only in a late hymn. Narmada finds no mention. Conflicts of the Aryans. At this time, the Aryans had not wholly subjugated the indigenous inhabitants. Though many hymns refer to battles between one Aryan tribe and another, the main conflict was between the Aryans and the indigenous Dasas and Dasyus. The Dasas are described as dark and ill-favored, bull-lipped, snub-nosed worshippers of the Phallus and of hostile speech. They were rich in cattle and dwelt in fortified places called Pur, of which the Aryan war god Indra had destroyed hundreds. Since the Dasas are also mentioned in the ancient Iranian literature, they also seem to have been a branch of the early Aryans. The Rig Veda mentions the defeat of Sambara by a chief called Devodasa, who belonged to the Bharata clan. In this case, the term Dasa appears in the name of Devodasa. Possibly the Dasyus were the original inhabitants of the country, and an Aryan chief who overpowered them was called Trasadasyu. The Aryan chief was soft towards the Dasas, but strongly hostile to the Dasyus. The term Dasyuhatya, slaughter of the Dasyus, is repeatedly mentioned in the Rig Veda. The Dasyus possibly worshipped the Phallus and did not keep cattle for dairy products. Other enemies of the Aryans were the Panij. Panij were wealthy people who refused to patronize the Vedic priests and who stole the cattle of the Aryans. They were not so strongly hated as the Dasyus, and their settlements were left unmolested. Probably the Panijs were Semitic traders. Though many of the vanquished Dasas must have been enslaved, some seem to have come to terms with the conquerors, and one Dasa chief is mentioned as following Aryan ways and patronizing the Brahmins. The Rig Vedic language, even in the earliest stratum, was appreciably affected by non-Aryan influences. The military technique of the early Aryans was much advanced. The Aryans succeeded everywhere because they possessed chariots driven by horses. They introduced the horse and chariot into West Asia and India. The Aryan soldiers were probably equipped also with coats of mail and better arms. The Aryan priestly schools had raised the tribal sacrifice to a fine art, and their poetry was elaborate and formalized. But they had not developed a city civilization. The complete absence of any words connected with writing in the Rig Veda, despite its size and the many contexts in which such words might be expected to occur, is almost certain proof that the Aryans were illiterate. They were a people of warlike stock breeders, organized in tribes rather than in kingdoms. Polity in Rig Vedic age. The tribes were ruled by chiefs who bore the title Rajan. The Rajan was not an absolute monarch, for the government of the tribe was in part the responsibility of the tribal councils like Sabha, Samiti, Gana, and Vidhata. Even women attended the Sabha and the Vidata. The Rajan's post was generally hereditary, but we have mention of election of the king by the tribal assembly Samiti. He protected his tribe and its cattle, fought its war, and offered prayers to gods on its behalf. The king was assisted by a few functionaries, of which Purohit was the most important. The Purohit, by his sacrifices, ensured the prosperity of the tribe in peace and its victory in war. Often he appears as a tribal medicine man, performing magical ceremonies and muttering spells for victory both before and during battle. The next important functionary seems to be the Suhani General, who was responsible under the king for minor campaigns and cattle raids against neighboring tribes. There was no regular or standing army. In times of war, the king mustered a militia whose military functions were performed by different tribal groups like Vrata, Gana, Grama, and Sardha. The Aryans looked on the king primarily as a leader in war, responsible for the defense of the tribe. He was in no sense divine at this early period and had no religious functions except to order sacrifices for the good of the tribe and to support the priests who performed them. The priest king of some other early cultures had no counterpart here. There was no regular revenue system, and the king was maintained by the voluntary tribute of his subjects and the booty won in battle. There is no reference to the judicial functions of the king. There were cases of theft and burglary, especially theft of cows. Spies were employed to check them. The officer who enjoyed authority over the pasture ground was called Vrajapati. He led the heads of the families or the heads of the fighting hordes to battle. In the beginning, the Gramani was just the head of a small tribal fighting unit, but when the unit settled, the Gramani became the head of the village and later became identified with the Vrajpati. Several chieftains were mentioned in the Rig Veda by name, but only one king is recorded as performing any deed of historical importance. This is Sudas, king of the Bharatas, the tribe that dwelled on the upper reaches of the river Saraswati. 3 hymns or poems of the Rig Veda describe the great battle of the 10 kings, at which Sudas defeated a coalition of 10 tribes, 5 Aryan tribes and 5 non-Aryan tribes of Punjab and the northwest on the banks of the river Parushani, the modern Ravi. The most powerful of these 10 tribes was that of the Purus, who dwelt on the lower Saraswati and were the Bharata's western neighbors. Their king, Purukutsa, was apparently killed in the battle. In the succeeding age, we hear no more of either Bharatas or Purus, but a new tribe, that of the Kurus, controlled the old land of the Bharatas and the northern Ganga-Yamuna doab. Rig Vedic society. When the Aryans entered India, there was already a class division in their tribal structure. Even in the earliest hymns, we read of Kshatriya, the nobility, and the vis-a-vis, the ordinary tribesmen, and the records of several other early Indo-European peoples suggest that tribal aristocracy was a feature of Indo-European society, even before the tribes migrated from their original home. As they settled among the darker aboriginals, the Aryans seem to have laid greater stress than before on purity of blood, and class divisions hardened to exclude those Dasas who had found a place on the fringe of Aryan society, and those Aryans who had intermarried with the Dasas and adopted their ways. Both these groups were low on the social scale. The term Varna was used for color, the Aryans being fair, the Dasyus dark. The priests whose sacrificial lore became more and more complicated gradually arrogated higher privileges to themselves. Together with the chiefs, they acquired a larger share of the booty, thus growing at the expense of the common people. Social inequalities thus grew. The Dasas conquered by the Aryans were treated as slaves or Shudras. Gradually, the tribal society got divided into 3 groups: warriors, priests, and commoners. Later, the 4th, Shudra, was added towards the end of the Rig Vedic period. This 4-fold division was given religious sanction as evident from the Purush Sukta hymn, which many scholars contend, however, to be a later interpolation. In this hymn, the four classes are said to have emanated from the dismembered primeval man who was sacrificed by the gods at the beginning of the world. Brahman from the mouth, Kshatriya from the arms, Vaishya from the thighs, and Shudra from the feet. Family was the basic unit of society. A group of related families formed a gram, a term which later regularly meant village, but which in the Rig Veda usually refers to a group of kinsfolk rather than to a settlement. The family was staunchly patrilineal and patriarchal. The wife, though she enjoyed a respectable position, was definitely subordinate to her husband. In the Rig Veda, no desire is expressed for daughters, though the desire for children and cattle appears repeatedly. We have an instance of 5 women who composed hymns. Marriage was usually monogamous and indissoluble, for there is no reference to divorce. But there are certain indications of polyandry, levirate, and widow remarriage. There are no examples of child marriage, and the marriageable age in the Rig Veda seems to have been 16 to 17. Divisions based on occupations had started, but this division was not very sharp. Gifts of cattle, chariots, horses, slaves, etc. were given, but there were no gifts of land, and even those of cereals were rare. Kinship was the basis of social structure. People's primary loyalty was to the tribe, Jana. The term for family, Kula, rarely occurs in the Rig Veda. It included not only mother, father, sons, slaves, etc., but many more people also. Probably the term for family was Griha. Differentiation in family relationships leading to the setting up of separate households had not proceeded far. Unequal distribution of the spoils of war created social inequalities, and this helped the rise of princes and priests at the cost of the common people. The Aryans were a wild, turbulent people, and had few of the taboos prevalent in later India. They were much addicted to inebriating drinks, of which they had at least 2, Soma and Sura. Soma was drunk at sacrifices, and its use was sanctified by religion. Sura was purely secular and more potent, and was disapproved by the priestly poets.